The room got cold a long time before anybody admitted it out loud. And the part that should be eating at the embassy boss right now is not the diss, not the chart, not the halftime show, not the lawsuit, not even the pop-out. It is the fact that Kendrick Lamar didn't just turn paranoia into a weapon. He turned it into a long-term business strategy. And the Toronto General has been moving like a man who can hear footsteps in the hallway, even when the hallway is empty. Everybody keeps trying to file this story under rap beef, like it's still 2018, like we're still grading bars, like the only question on the table is who had the harder punchline on which Friday. That is the kindergarten version of what is actually happening. The grown-up version is that Aubrey Drake Graham has spent the entire post-Dash Not Like Us era publicly rapping about traitors, fake friends, people who were standing beside him 1 minute and showing up at somebody else's concert the next. And the man on the other side of the war, Kendrick Lamar, has not had to say a single new word about him to keep winning. Read that again, because it is the whole movie. One man is silent and still gaining altitude. The other man is loud and still bleeding. And the reason that pattern keeps repeating is that Kendrick figured out something most rap strategists never figure out in an entire career. You do not have to prove there is a mole inside the empire if you can make the empire act like there is one. You do not need a name, a face, a badge, a hard drive, or a confession on camera. You only need the boss to keep checking the locks. And when we get to the lawsuit section, and I promise you we are getting there, because that is where the mole stops being a person and starts looking like a climate, you are going to understand why the strongest record Kendrick ever made on Drake was not Like Us. It was the silence that came after it. Because that silence is doing more damage in year 2 than the diss did in week 1. The personal stakes, the cultural stakes, the systemic stakes, they all collapse into one ugly question that the Iceman salesman cannot answer no matter how many ice sculptures he parks in a driveway. If your own house was solid, why do you keep rapping like you're checking who's still inside it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. So let's set the table the right way, because if you strip away the timeline, this just sounds like internet noise. And that is exactly how the Stand Army wants you to file it. Kendrick Lamar and Drake did not wake up one Tuesday and decide to become enemies. That friction had been simmering for over a decade, going all the way back to the early Big Sean Control verse era. Through the cold features, the colder silences, the subtweets disguised as bars, the entire long quiet war of two men who were always too big to share the same throne. Then 2024 detonated all of it. Kendrick's verse on Future and Metro Boomins, like that, turned the simmer into a public war. Then came Push-Ups. Then Taylor made Freestyle. Then Euphoria. Then 616 in LA. Then Drake's Family Matters. Then, on the same night, Kendrick dropped Meet the Grahams. And then less than a day later, Not Like Us. That is not a back and forth. That is a coordinated, paced ambush. And the piece nobody wants to slow down enough to appreciate is that 616 in LA is the exact moment Kendrick stopped insulting Drake and started suggesting Drake's own walls were porous, that the people standing closest to him might already be standing somewhere else in their hearts. That was the switch from battle rap to psychological warfare. And once that switch flips, you cannot flip it back. You can win the next round on points. You cannot win back the part of your audience that just learned to read your silences as evidence. The musical stakes here are obvious. Drake's machine has always run on volume, ubiquity, anticipation. The sense that he can flood the zone, set the mood, and reclaim the timeline whenever he wants. Kendrick runs on the opposite principle. Less output, more event value. Every release calibrated to feel like a cultural moment, not a content drop. So when the public starts believing Kendrick can predict, absorb, and pre-counter Drake's moves before they even land, that is not embarrassing. That is catastrophic to the core Drake brand. Because the core Drake brand was always he's everywhere, he's unstoppable, he sees you before you see him. Kendrick reversed the polarity on that in one weekend. Culturally, the stakes are even higher. Drake spent over a decade positioned as the gravitational center of the genre, the giant everybody had to orbit, whether they loved him, envied him, copied him, or sneak dissed him for clout. Kendrick's 2024 campaign reframed him not as the unavoidable center, but as the vulnerable incumbent. And that is a fundamentally different chair to sit in. Vulnerable incumbents do not get the benefit of a doubt anymore. Every rollout becomes a referendum. Every feature becomes a poll. Every silence becomes a Rorschach test. And financially, let me be very clear about this, because the basic channels keep treating reputation like it's some soft emotional thing. Reputation, at this tier of rap, is a hard business asset. It moves brand deals, it moves touring guarantees, it moves publishing valuations, it moves label leverage. It moves the basic psychological floor of the fan base that decides whether a comeback rollout is exciting or desperate. And the unresolved tension underneath all of this, the question the rest of this video has to answer, is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Was Kendrick actually hearing secrets from inside OVO? Or was Kendrick simply reading the room so much better than everybody else that it didn't matter whether the mole was a person or just a feeling? Let's start with the surface, because the surface evidence alone is already worse for the Toronto general than his defenders want to admit. The first verifiable piece is Kendrick's own wording on 6/16 in LA. This was not vague, they say energy. This was not subliminal. He directly framed Drake as a man surrounded by people whispering that he deserves what is happening. And he tightened the screw with the now infamous suggestion that OVO was working for him. He doubled down with a line about 100 people on salary and 20 of them wanting the boss as a casualty. Now, is that a personnel document? No. Let's be adults here. It is a diss track, not an HR audit. But the verifiable, undeniable part is that Kendrick chose betrayal inside the camp as one of his core pressure points. And in rap beef, the pressure point you choose tells the audience exactly which insecurity you believe will land the hardest. He didn't pick Drake's pen. He didn't pick Drake's height. He didn't pick Drake's parents. He picked the locks on Drake's front door. That is a choice, and that choice is the first piece of public evidence. The second piece is Drake's response on The Heart Part 6. This is where the embassy boss tried to flip the entire board and claim that nothing was uncovered. His team had actually planted fake information about a daughter and watched Kendrick swallow it whole. Now again, that is Drake's claim, not independently verified fact, and I want everyone listening to keep their hands off the red button until we walk through what it actually means. Because here is the part the Stand Army does not want to sit with. A man who feels fully in control does not respond to "your camp is leaking" by arguing he invented the leak himself. That is not what confidence sounds like. That is what narrative containment sounds like. That is the audio version of someone tripping in public and announcing, No, I meant to do that. I always want to fall on my face today. It was on the schedule." And if you were one of the people who heard that record and said, "Yep, airtight, no further questions," I just have to laugh. Because that response strategy raised more questions than the original allegation. The third piece of surface evidence is the loyalty language did not disappear after the war ended. It came back. On What Did I Miss? Drake himself reopened the file. He rapped about looking to his right and the same people who used to be standing beside him, then asked how people he loved could hang around individuals who tried him, and capped it with a line about love for his brothers and death to a traitor. That is not fan theory. That is not me putting words in his mouth. That is the man at the center of the empire personally putting the word traitor back on the public table months after the diss cycle ended. He also pointed at Kendrick's pop-out concert and at people who showed up there despite supposedly riding with him since the early days. The fourth piece is the scoreboard. And the scoreboard is where the cultural loss became a measurable one. Not Like Us did not just chart. It set records. It dominated hot rap songs in a way that historic crossover records hadn't done before. It pulled massive weekly streaming numbers deep into its run, 8-figure audience impressions on radio. And it did this not in week one when curiosity peaks, but week after week after week, which is a part that should genuinely terrify the Toronto camp, because that is not novelty. That is repeat behavior. The audience kept choosing the song that symbolized Drake's worst week as a public figure, over and over, for months. That means Kendrick did not just wound the man. He commercialized the wound. He turned the allegations, the chants, the mockery, the rhythm, the catchphrases, all of it, into a mainstream product the public wanted on repeat. One man dropped a diss. The other man got turned into a recurring summer infrastructure problem. And then the fifth piece hits the table like a bag of bricks. Kendrick took Not Like Us to the Super Bowl, the halftime stage, the single biggest mainstream entertainment platform in America. He performed the record that symbolized the public collapse of Drake's narrative control in front of one of the largest audiences any halftime show has ever drawn, a number reported to exceed the actual game's viewership. So when the Iceman salesman's defenders try to shrink this back down to, "It was just internet noise," can we please have the real conversation now? Internet noise does not get booked at the Super Bowl. Internet noise does not become the most watched halftime in the format's history. Psychological warfare does not stay imaginary when an entire country is doing the call and response on primetime television. And I think we just need to set the truth on what is actually happening here. The surface evidence is not proving a courtroom-ready mole with a name and a forwarding address. The surface evidence is proving something arguably worse, that betrayal became the central public theme of this feud, that Drake himself kept returning to that theme long after the song stopped trading, and that Kendrick kept winning so decisively that every visible crack in OVO's circle started to read, to the audience, like confirmation of the original allegation. In a credibility battle, perception isn't everything, but it is so close to everything that the distinction stops paying rent. And oh, do I have more for you? Because if the surface evidence was just Kendrick alleging whispers in OVO and Drake later rapping about traitors, the Stand Army could still parachute into the comments wearing their homemade master manipulator badges and tell us all to relax. The next layer is where that strategy stops working. This is the layer where we stop looking only at the songs and start looking at the people around the songs. The collaborators, the guests, the side comments, the old rivals, the public positioning, the body language at events, the features that didn't happen, the cosigns that quietly stopped. If you're one of the people still pretending the room never tilted on the Toronto General, stay with me through this entire cultural breakdown, because by the time we hit the lawsuit section, the word mole is not going to feel like a person anymore. It is going to feel like the weather. The first cultural piece nobody wants to revisit is that Kendrick was not the only major artist to imply leaks around Drake's operation. The Weeknd on All to Myself delivered a line that hip-hop publications immediately read as a cosign of the same accusation, that something inside the operation was compromised. Now again, that is not proof, and we are staying disciplined here. But when two of the biggest, most strategically careful artists in the genre, both with personal history with Drake, both operating at the top tier of the industry, independently circle the exact same weakness in their lyrics, that is not nothing. That is two surgeons pointing at the same scan. Especially in a culture where artists almost never name names directly, where indirect language is the genre's native dialect, that kind of overlap is not coincidence. It is consensus disguised as ambiguity. The second cultural piece is the historical thread, and this is where outlets like XXL did the heavy lifting by reminding the audience that Drake's "Somebody Around Me Knew Too Much" problem did not start in 2024. It did not start with Kendrick. It started years earlier with Pusha T and the story of Adidon, where the central scandal was not just the existence of a child. It was the question of how, exactly, the information about that child reached the other side. Whose phone? Whose studio? Whose conversation? Whose loose lip? The answer to that question has been publicly debated for years, with different camps pointing fingers at different members of Drake's inner orbit. And depending on whose version you believe, the leak was either a producer or a longtime collaborator. The point is not to relitigate that fight. The point is that the cultural memory was already built. So when Kendrick steps to the microphone in 2024 and suggests OVO is working for him, the audience is not hearing that line cold. They are hearing it through a pre-existing archive of Drake-related leak narratives. And that archive is doing half the persuasive work for free. The third cultural piece is the pop-out itself. And this is the moment the basic channels still cannot bring themselves to fully describe. Kendrick's Juneteenth concert in Los Angeles was not just a victory lap. It was a live demonstration of how much of the room had quietly relocated. Outlets like Pitchfork described it as a rallying point and a West Coast reunion, with Dr. Dre appearing on stage and Kendrick performing Not Like Us multiple times to a stadium that treated the song like a national anthem. But the part that mattered most for this conversation was not the headliners. It was the orbit. It was who else showed up. It was the energy of figures who had previously been associated, even loosely, with Drake's world appearing publicly and visibly aligned with Kendrick's moment. Beefs at this level are not scored by bars alone. They are scored by who feels safe standing where, who shows up with you, who avoids eye contact, who suddenly becomes neutral right after years of public proximity. That is the culture taking attendance, and the attendance sheet on Juneteenth told a very specific story. The fourth cultural piece, and this is where it gets uncomfortable for the defenders, is that Drake himself acknowledged the drift. Publications like Pitchfork and Rolling Stone pointed directly at What Did I Miss? As a record that centers broken loyalties, with explicit references to people showing up at the pop-out who had been riding with him since the headlines era. He doesn't name the person. He doesn't have to. The refusal to name is itself a tell, because unnamed resentment is almost always the signature of a grievance that has spread too wide to point at a single target. If you cannot decide whether your problem is one individual or a whole pattern, that means the trust damage is not localized. That means it is climate. And the fifth cultural piece is the way mainstream outlets stopped framing the beef as sparring and started framing it as psychological domination. Major publications described Kendrick's barrage as conceptual, relentless, and perception shifting. The framing matters enormously, because once mainstream culture starts reading every move through the lens of Kendrick got in his head, then even neutral events stop being neutral. A regular feature looks reactive. A delayed rollout looks scared. A confident performance looks rehearsed. A friend drifting looks like a leak. This is the part that should be eating the embassy boss alive, because it does not matter what is actually happening inside the camp anymore. What matters is what the camp's every public move is now being interpreted to mean. And I want to give the counter-argument air, because that is what honest analysis does. The counter-argument is straightforward. Kendrick could have guessed the right psychological angle. Drake's fake info claim could be true. Affiliates moving around publicly after a major rap war does not prove they leaked anything. Fair. Genuinely fair. If we only had one of these pieces in isolation, I would tell you to slow down. But the problem for the Iceman salesman is that this is no longer one piece. Kendrick alleged the whispers. The Weeknd echoed the operation. Drake himself rapped about traitors. The pop-out visibly showcased the drift. The lawsuit escalated the optics. 1 coincidence, maybe. 2 suspicious. 3 a pattern. 4 a climate. And that is the gear shift, because the real story here is not about one secretive little gremlin sliding files under a door. The real story is about what happens when a rap beef migrates from records into systems. This is where the basic channels clock out and the real conversation begins, because what we are actually watching is not a feud anymore. It is a stress test of an entire ecosystem. Look at the first systemic angle: narrative ownership. Drake's defining superpower for over a decade was not that he never lost moments. It was that he never lost a frame. He could meme his way through bad weeks. He could outstream his critics. He could quote caption his way around scandal. He could simply outvolume the conversation by releasing more music, more content, more posts, more features, until the timeline forgot what it was originally upset about. That superpower required one specific thing to function. The public had to believe his version was the default. Kendrick's 2024 campaign disrupted that by forcing a frame Drake cannot scrub away. The frame that the OVO structure might be compromised from within. Once that idea enters the bloodstream of the audience, the boss is no longer managing a song cycle. He is managing suspicion. And suspicion is expensive. It forces over-explanation. It changes how silence reads. It makes confidence look rehearsed. It makes ordinary rollout moves look like cope. That is why we fed you the information on the Heart Part 6 matters so much in retrospect. It was not just a counterpunch. It was an emergency frame correction, and the audience could feel the emergency in it. The second systemic angle is the conversion of cultural victory into institutional victory. And this is the angle that does not get enough credit. Not Like Us did not just win on Twitter. It won on Billboard. It won on radio. It won at cookouts. It won at clubs. It won at weddings. It won at funerals, somehow. It won enough that it set a record for the longest run at the top of hot rap songs. And then it won the Super Bowl halftime stage. That means the institutional machinery of the music business, the same machinery that has spent a decade rewarding Drake, turned around and amplified the song that symbolized his worst week. The machine did not rescue him. The machine validated the version of events that damaged him. And once a diss record becomes a business phenomenon of that scale, the loser is not just absorbing a reputational hit. He is watching the market itself reward the story of his fall. That is not a black eye. That is the entire face. The third systemic angle is the most uncomfortable one, and it is the one I want everybody listening to sit with. Superstar ecosystems are not built on talent alone. They are built on internal belief. An operation at Drake scale is label relations, affiliate artists, in-house producers, engineers, day-to-day managers, road staff, social teams, media liaisons, partnership reps, brand consultants, content creators, security, an entire invisible labor force that turns a song into a season and a season into a year. If even a meaningful percentage of that ecosystem privately stops believing the principle is untouchable, the system slows down. It gets noisier. It gets leakier, not necessarily in the literal someone is selling file sense, but in the human temperature sense. Some people leak data. Some people leak energy. Some people leak loyalty by the way they post, by whose event they attend, by who they congratulate publicly versus privately, by how fast they return a text, by who gets the warm hug and industry party versus the polite handshake. Not every leak is a hard drive. Most leaks are human temperature. And human temperature is the hardest thing in this business to fake at scale. Kendrick, whether through actual intel or superior reading of that temperature or both, weaponized that climate better than anyone has against Drake in his entire career. And then there is the fourth angle that is downstream of all three, the comeback economy. Once you have lost the frame, lost the narrative, and lost the human temperature, every move you make from that point forward gets interpreted in a different key. The contrast with Kendrick here is brutal in its clarity. Kendrick's discipline makes silence feel intentional, even strategic, even devastating. Drake's spectacle now risks making intention feel compensatory. One man can disappear from public view for months and still feel present in the culture. The other has to put on shows, post ice sculptures, post numbers, post receipts, post locations, post anything. And every post is being read by a public that has already been trained to look for cracks. Listen, I genuinely enjoy ridiculous rap theatrics. I am not above any of it. But ridiculous rap theatrics hit differently when they arrive after the public has spent a year being told the boss is suspicious of his own perimeter. Context changes texture. The same gesture that looked like dominance in 2019 looks like distraction in 2025. That is not me. That is the room. And the cruelest part of all four of these systemic angles together is that Kendrick did not need to prove the literal mole in public to win with the idea of the mole. He only needed the concept to feel plausible enough, while stacking performance, timing, chart dominance, cultural ritual, and mainstream stage moments so overwhelmingly that Drake's later reactions would keep feeding the same story he was trying to escape. That is masterclass strategy. That is not winning a round. That is redesigning your opponent's reality, so that every move he makes inside, it confirms the new design. And now we have to say the part out loud, because this is the moment the entire video has been building toward, and I want everybody who has made it this far to lock in. Because if you understand what I am about to say, you will never look at a Drake rollout the same way again. The mole was never the point. Let me say that one more time, slower. Because the basic channels are going to spend the next year pretending they understood this from the beginning when they clearly did not. The mole was never the point. The leak Kendrick Lamar actually engineered was not a leak of information. It was a leak of belief. The most devastating thing he did to the biggest rap star of the streaming era was not allege that someone in the room was talking. It was convince the public, the industry, the affiliates, the media, the affiliates, and eventually the boss himself, that the room could no longer fully protect him from the truth of how people inside that room actually felt. And once belief walks out of a building, it does not come back wearing the same shoes. That is the truth bomb, and I want it to land with the weight it deserves. Because when you rewatch this entire saga through that lens, every single piece of evidence we have walked through stops being a separate story and becomes the same story. 616 in LA was not an accusation. It was a tuning fork. Drake's response on The Heart Part 6 was not a rebuttal. It was a confirmation that the tuning fork had found the resonant frequency. What Did I Miss was not a song about traitors. It was a public diary entry from a man who had been forced to start auditing his own friendships in real time. The pop-out was not a concert. It was a defection ceremony with stage lighting. The Super Bowl halftime show was not a performance. It was a coronation of the version of reality Kendrick had spent a year arguing for, broadcast to over 100 million people in primetime, with the man at the center of the original accusation watching from a position he could not fight back from. The lawsuit was not a legal strategy. It was allegedly, and as reported by multiple outlets, an attempt to use institutional machinery to reclaim a frame that the culture had already given to someone else. And the optics of a rap star at this tier reaching for legal remedy after a rap battle has, fairly or unfairly, become part of the long tail of this story, whether the stand army likes it or not. Every single one of these moments, when you stack them in sequence, is not a sequence of unrelated events. It is one continuous demonstration of the same underlying truth, that the most successful artist of his generation, the biggest streaming machine in the genre's history, the man with the most resources, the most affiliates, the most reach, the most platform, was outmaneuvered not by a louder voice or a better verse, but by a strategist who understood that you do not have to break an empire's walls if you can make the empire stop trusting its own walls. And that is why the strongest record Kendrick ever made on Drake is not Like Us, and never was. The strongest record is the silence. The strongest record is the fact that Kendrick Lamar has not had to deliver a single new word about the Toronto General in over a year, and the Toronto General has not been able to stop rapping about him. That is not a beef. That is asymmetric warfare. That is one man living rent-free in another man's discography, and the rent isn't even late. And here is the part that should leave Kendrick's audience calm and the rest of the room a little uneasy. The right person is still winning. And the right person is winning because the right person moved like a disciplined artist, not a panicked administrator. Kendrick turned pressure into sequencing. He turned a beef into a body of work. He turned a single song into a cultural referendum, then a historic chart run, then a record-setting Super Bowl moment, then a long ambient hum of cultural authority that does not require him to release anything to keep functioning. Meanwhile, the embassy boss has spent the entire fallout sounding like a man still trying to figure out which conversations happened after he left the room. And if you have made it this far in the video, you already understand why this matters beyond Stan War nonsense. We are watching, in real time, what happens when a rap empire gets forced into self-reference. Instead of moving forward cleanly, it keeps looking backward at who switched sides, who knew what, who showed up where, who was really with whom, who is still returning calls, who is suddenly available for features they used to be too busy for. That is not the energy of a throne. That is the energy of an audit. And I have to say this as plainly as I can because I know some of you are going to want to clip this part. Even if Drake drops a great album tomorrow, and he is more than capable of it, that is not the question. This whole episode has permanently changed the emotional architecture around him. That does not mean he is finished. He is not finished. The man is too talented and too embedded to be finished by a single beef. What it means is that the audience now listens with a second set of ears. Every line about loyalty now has a footnote. Every flex now has a context. Every silence now has a subtitle. That is the long-term cost. That is the part you cannot litigate, cannot stream past, cannot out-volume, cannot ice sculpt your way out of. So yes, I am landing this exactly where it belongs. Kendrick looks like the disciplined one because Kendrick was the disciplined one. The system kept rewarding his side of the story because his side of the story kept being the one the culture wanted to repeat. The public moments kept validating his leverage because his leverage was real. And Drake, fairly or unfairly, has continued to feed the suspicion that the strongest diss Kendrick ever landed on him was not a personal insult at all. It was the suggestion that the empire could not fully hide what its own atmosphere was already saying. One man makes music that asks the audience to believe him. The other makes music that lets the audience believe themselves. That is the contrast. That is the entire story compressed into one sentence. And the right person is still winning in public, in chart history, on the biggest stage in American entertainment, with his mouth closed. And this, I promise you, is only the start. Because the next chapter of this story is not going to be about who had the better diss. That conversation is over. That conversation has been over. The next chapter is going to be about two specific things, and I want you watching for both of them. The first is the legal tale of the lawsuit and how it gets framed by hip-hop scholars, journalists, and culture writers in the months ahead. Because if the legal fight keeps getting characterized as anti-hip-hop by serious voices in the space, that framing becomes part of the long tail of the legacy, whether fans want it to or not. And it will start affecting how every future Drake rollout is received by the press tier that ultimately decides what a comeback narrative is allowed to look like. The second is Kendrick's institutional absorption, the way his catalog, his pop-out, his Super Bowl set, and his entire 2024 to 2025 run get folded into the prestige machinery of the genre, the awards conversations, the cultural retrospectives, the greatest of all time debates that will reignite the second the next major year-end list drops. Those two trajectories are about to run in parallel, and they're going to keep reinforcing each other. And the only way to track them in real time without getting spun by the basic channels is to be subscribed right here, because that is exactly what we are going to be breaking down week after week. So drop a comment. Tell me what piece of the climate I just described you notice first. Hit like if you made it this far, because you are the reason this channel keeps doing the work the other channels won't. And if you have not subscribed yet, that is the move right now, because the next video off this one has an even nastier angle. The next video is not, was there a mole? The next video is why Drake's comeback rollout keeps proving Kendrick's biggest point. And the shock there is that every single effort the Toronto General makes to look bigger is making the original wound more visible. The mystery is whether the music itself can outrun the meaning that is now permanently attached to it. And the payoff is understanding why some empires do not fall from one blow. They fall when every future move reminds the audience of the first crack. That is the click. That is the next one. I will see you in it.